a series called Hope and Doubt. For all of us who've been followers of Jesus Christ for a while, there comes a moment when something happens that just knocks us off our feet. That causes us to question. It's not an intellectual doubt. Most of us who've been followers of Jesus Christ for a while, we have no trouble with the intellectual side of it. There is enough evidence for Jesus. There's enough evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In fact, what we begin to deal with is a emotional doubt. There's this emotional moment when we get knocked off our feet and we look at God and we say, but God, if you love me, why? God, how could you allow this to happen? God, this is not fair. And it causes us for a while to deal with a doubt that we all struggle with. Now, as we're coming to an end, we got one more Sunday next week. We're going to finish this up next week. But we've been talking about this idea that sometimes there is hope in doubt, because what doubt sometimes causes us to do is to reevaluate what we believe. What is this about? So often, unmeaningly or unmeaning, I'm not sure, that's bad English, but not meaning to, we pick up bad ideas, we pick up bad theology, we pick up bad beliefs that cause us to believe something about God, and we take on promises that He never promised us. Sometimes as we go through these moments that we struggle with, we think this is the end, and in fact, what it does is it stops and it helps us put our feet back on solid ground. There is hope in doubt. I want to talk today about the idea of how there's this hope and doubt that comes not from you, but from somewhere greater. Over the years, I have met some amazing men and women who I do not know how, but they have gone through some of the toughest things that I could ever imagine. And yet they seem to come out on the other side with a faith that is stronger, that is more vibrant, that in a sense challenges me, that I go, I'm not sure how you can do this, but that's what I want to be. We almost look at them as superheroes. Now, when it comes to when we read the Bible, there is a guy who I look at that is like a superhero of the faith. We call him Paul. I can imagine, blue gown, little red square on it with a big P on it. Superman Paul is this man that as we begin to read about him, he is the superhero. He is the guy who gets knocked down and gets straight back up again. But even Paul, as we're going to look at today, deals with times where he struggled. Even the guy who saw what he had saw, who had experienced what he experienced, found times when there was moments that knocked him almost off his feet. Now, most of us in here, we've been in church a while. I realize that. And so as we begin to talk about Paul, you're going to say, I already know this. So, kind of get to the point, will you? But will you just bear with me just for a moment? For in order for us to help us understand how Paul became who he was, we kind of need to know his background. And just in case, I'm going to just tell this in the James way, okay? So bear with me. Just give me a little bit of latitude and I'll move it as fast as I can. The Apostle Paul was born in a pretty prominent, wealthy Jewish family. And because of it, he had opportunities and privileges that most people of his day did not have. He was educated by the top religious leaders of his day. And in fact, this education and probably his family connection caused him to go far and fast, both in the political circles and the religious circles in Jerusalem. Now, as a young man, the Apostle Paul, if you've ever met a guy who was passionate about something, Paul was one of these guys. I mean, he was the kind of guy who was so driven that once he believed in a cause, he went after it full force. Well, as a young man who was trained in Judaism, he became convinced that Judaism needed to be cleaned up from a new little sect that had begun to spring up in Jerusalem. It was a little sect called the Way, and we all know it today as Christianity. But at the time, it was a sect called the Way, and it was based upon this guy by the name of Jesus who had come, who said he was of God. He died on a cross, and 3 days later, he rose again. And it seemed like to Paul that all of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas was beginning to go after this Jesus. And Paul was convinced that Judaism needed to be cleaned up, so he got permission from the people that he needed to get permission on to start to clean up Judaism. And passionately, he went out and he arrested believers. He had them put into prison. He had land confiscated. He had certain key figures put to death, and he went to it at full force. And as you can imagine, the Christians in Jerusalem began to go underground a little bit, and many of them took off and fled Jerusalem to other towns. As Paul began to see that the Christians were beginning to flee Jerusalem, he got permission to chase them down to other communities around. In fact, so much so, he ended up going and getting permission to go all the way to Damascus. Now, Damascus was about a 150-mile trip, and for us today, we're going, well, that's only 2 and a bit hours drive? In Paul's days, 150 miles was about a 2-week trip. Paul was so passionate about getting Judaism cleaned up that he got permission to trace Christians down, or people of the Way, up to a 2-week trip away in order to clean this up. Now, you know the story because we've all heard of the Damascus Road experience, right? You've ever heard someone say, oh, I had a Damascus Road experience? Well, that was Paul. Paul, on his way to Damascus, found himself traveling, and he got knocked off his horse by this great light. And he had this conversation, and he had a conversion experience on the road where he said, Jesus, if you're going to do this to me, I'm going to follow you. If you got the power to knock me off my horse and cause me to go blind, whatever it takes, I'll follow. Now, one of the things we don't know is that there's a couple-year gap in Paul's story where things go silent. He basically, as far as we understand, he basically worked in a church. He traveled. He visited, we understand, probably the other apostles for a time. But for a couple of years, he went silent. But the thing is when you have a personality like Paul, there is no staying silent. The same drive that caused him to chase people 2 weeks away began to cause Paul to say, you know what? I can't sit any longer. I got to go. The same thing that caused me to want to kill people is now the same desire that makes me want to go and tell people about this one I was trying to wipe out. Now, let's just say at this moment, Paul could have made a nice little name for himself by simply traveling around the churches around Jerusalem, being the poster boy of the bad boy who went good. Now, we all know these stories, don't we? I mean, don't we always see them? They show up on billboards. The bad boy who became good. I mean, he was the drug dealer. He was the gang member. We make big things of it today, don't we? Paul was the ultimate poster boy that he could have made a name for himself, and he probably could have made a pretty good little tidy sum by picking up offerings, going to all these little churches saying, remember, I was the guy who was trying to kill you? I was the guy who took away your land, and now I've given my life to Jesus, and I want to tell you all the good things that he can do for you too. But that's not Paul. Paul decided that that's not who I am. In fact, this thing that drove me to try to take people's lives, I so want people now to have a life. And it caused him to go to places where the name of Jesus was just a bygone name. They'd heard about it. The name Jesus has spread throughout the Roman Empire, but who he was, they didn't really know. They had just heard about this Jesus, this guy who was causing an uproar in Jerusalem and causing everyone to kind of go nuts around there and causing these Jews to kind of spring up in all sorts of places claiming, I'm a follower of that man. And Paul said, you know what, I want to go to these places. And he began to go to Gentile cities, and that just means non-Jewish cities all over the Roman Empire, to tell people about this man by the name of Jesus Christ. Now, if this was me, if I was God at this point, I would say, you know what, I'm going to put a little bubble around the Apostle Paul, and I'm going to protect him because he's doing something great for me. Isn't that what we would assume? Here's Paul. He's so passionate about me that you think God would go, I'm going to just put a little bubble around him. I'm going to protect him. I'm going to make his way a little bit easier so that, I want my name to be heard. But that's not what happened. If you can follow the Apostle Paul's life, here's what we find out. It was tough. Paul went through experiences that most of us, and by the way, and I say most of us because there are some of you who've been through some experiences that have been so tough that I cannot even imagine. But for most of us, we cannot even imagine what the Apostle Paul went through. All we know is that there comes a point that when he writes to the Corinthian church in the book of 2 Corinthians, and in fact, we call it the book of 2 Corinthians. It is probably really book of 4 Corinthians. We just only have been preserved 2 of them. We believe there were probably 2 other letters in between that Paul wrote trying to figure out the problems to this Corinthian church. In fact, this church was one of those churches that about drove Paul to the edge of his faith. Churches don't do that. But this was one of them. And as he's writing the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul is actually at a point where I think he has about worked through the problems that have come up. In fact, Paul is dealing with it from a place of, I need to explain some stuff to you. You've ever had one of those conversations with your son, your daughter, where you're saying, I need to explain some stuff to you. You see me as, and yet I need to explain I am not who you think I am. There is something bigger behind why I do what I do and why I say what I say. And 2 Corinthians is sort of one of these letters. 2 Corinthians is a place where Paul, on the one hand, starts to deal with some real emotional feeling. And if you've ever read the book of 2 Corinthians, it's easy to miss. But if you actually just stop and read it, in a sense, as a letter to a group of people that Paul loves, but they have hurt him bad, that's what 2 Corinthians is. And you can begin to hear this emotion. And as he begins to write this letter, Paul begins to deal with some of these hard times that drove Paul almost to the edge of his faith. And what caused him to keep hope when everything seemed lost? Paul begins to tell us, and as he goes through the book of Corinthians, in fact, several times it's over before we even get to the passage we're going to read. There are several times before this already. He's even mentioned it several times. In fact, we know this must have really been bothering him because at least 2 other times he deals with this. This has got me to the edge. It got me to the edge. I thought I was done. But first, Paul dealt with this idea, something that, guys, you don't understand. You see me as a certain way, and I think you've missed what I've gone through. But the first thing that began to drive Paul to this place to the edge of his faith was simply this thing to survive. Now, what do I mean, this thing to... By the time Paul writes the book of 2 Corinthians, he is on his 3rd missionary journey. He started off on his missionary journeys probably in his 40s, and by now he's in his 50s. He's probably up in his about mid-50s. We're just going to say he's 55, 56. We don't think of that as old today. In fact, I kind of look at that pretty young. But he's been doing this for 10 years, and at 10 years, he's been through so much. In 10 years, he's on his third missionary trip now. He didn't have big gaps between his trips. They kind of merged one back into another. But he stops and he says this, in the last 10 years, guys, here's what I've been through physically. And I'm going to pick this up in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 27. So just read along with me. And feel the emotion. I want you to stop and not just read the words, but I want you to see this from a guy who is talking to a group that he so dearly loves. But this is a group of people who have hurt Paul bad. Here's what he says. I need you guys to understand. 5 times, 5 times, I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. For some reason, there was this thing about showing mercy by not doing 40 lashes, so they gave 39. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. And I'm sure he counted every strike. 3 times, this is in the last 10 years, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones, and by the way, we can read this over in the book of Acts, and this time of being pelted with stones, it says they left him for dead. So he says, once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I have been shipwrecked. And by the way, he's not done with being shipwrecked. We know as he goes to Rome, all this sort of, it just continues. But 3 times I have been shipwrecked. There was a night, or there was a time I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I didn't think I was going to survive. I have been constantly on the move. I don't have a house that I own. I don't have a bed that I spend my nights in. I've been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in dangers from bandits, in dangers from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled, and I have often gone without sleep. I have known what it's like to be hungry and thirsty, for I have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. As he's writing this as a guy who has endured 10 years of constant physical affliction. His body is sore. How many more beatings can you take? How many more times can you deal with being shipwrecked? How much more strength do you have in your body, Paul? Paul could have said, I'm in my 50s, and my body just can't take much more of this. But it wasn't just his body that was beginning to physically hurt. Paul was beginning to deal with an emotional hurt that we can sometimes, some of you have been through this, where you know someone you love and it's kind of backfired and it's hurt. And Paul has this emotional connection to these churches that he has started. And yet as he starts these churches, he's finding himself, especially in this church, on a constant attack. There have been guys, as he started this church and as he left, he spent several months. In fact, we believe that Paul spent for a while there, probably over 14 months at the Corinthian church the first time, trying to strengthen and encourage them. But as he left, there were a group of guys who came in after him. Now, in some churches, these groups were people who were trying to come in and make them Jews. Hey, you need to become more of a Jew. The church in Corinth, it seems like the guys who were coming in after him may have been part of that, but it might have been also a group that came in who actually just saw this as a money-making opportunity. Paul talks about them as these guys are greedy. They come to take your money. It was a small church that people thought they could prey on. And the problem is that they began to listen to these people who came in and believe them. And they didn't try to fix the problems. In fact, as Paul left and as he moved on, the problems that started happening were problems such as they began to fight with each other. They took each other to court. There were sexual sins going on of all sorts that you couldn't even imagine. And Paul says it's not even named amongst people who don't even go to church. They began to take the Lord's Supper and they turned it into a party. The problems just laid on one after the other. And these teachers that came in did not try to solve the problems. They simply looked at taking advantage of the people. Worse than that, they took Paul, who had started the church, and they said, give us a break, Paul. Let me read what they said. Paul deals with one of those accusations from the start. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10, here's what these teachers were coming in and saying about Paul. For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person, he's unimpressive and he speaks amounts of. Can you hear the hurt? Paul had spent a huge amount of his time investing in this little church. Physically, his body is tired. Emotionally, he's dealing with these constant attacks. And the people that he's loved, that he has invested his time in, that he's physically put himself on the line for, are now attacking him going, you don't even speak that good, Paul. You're weak, you're unimpressive, you're a nobody. Why would we spend our time listening to you? And Paul says, in spite of this, he goes down and says in 2 Corinthians 11:28, he says, in spite of this, and he uses the word besides. In spite of this, I face this pressure of my concern for the churches. In other words, in spite of what you do, I still feel a responsibility towards you. But it's not done. He has this physical part where his body is hurting. He's got this place where as he's looking through the book of 2 Corinthians, he's on this emotional, I'm struggling, guys. You don't understand. I need to have this one-on-one, and I think we've about got this worked out, but I need you to understand where I'm coming from. But he goes, there's this one more, and in fact, this is the one that almost put him over the edge. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, as he continues on, he's talking to them and he says, all right, there's just one other thing I need to tell you about. And in verse 7, he says, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Whatever the Apostle Paul was going through, we don't know. Now, there's some ideas, but whatever it is, this third thing, yeah, his body is hurting. He's gone through time after time of beatings and stonings, and physically he's just tired. Emotionally, he's been dealing with this constant attack from false teachers who continually come after him, who are taking away people and taking advantage of their faith. But he says, the thing that has gotten to me about the most, he says, is this thing. I was given this thorn in the flesh, and he doesn't tell us what it is. But whatever it is so deep, and it is so strong, and it is festering so bad that he calls it, what does he call it? It's a thorn. You ever gotten a thorn? You ever been rose gardening or got a thorn that's gotten down that you can't get back out and just sits and festers? You know it's bad. But Paul says this is not just so bad. He says it is so bad. I call it a messenger of Satan. And it torments me. Whoa, hang on a moment. This is superhero Paul. Here is a man who wrote half of our New Testament. Here's a man who stopped and explains our faith in a way that stops that we say we don't fully understand that he's fought for the church. Hey, salvation by grace through faith alone, not by works, not by keeping the law. Paul is the guy who helps us understand that. He's the one who went to the apostles and fought in the early church going, hey, let's keep this on track. Let's keep our main thing the main thing. I mean, this is superhero stuff. And Paul says, there's this thing that I have that is tormenting me. It's like a messenger of Satan, and I'm tormented by it. In fact, in verse 29, he goes on to say, back in chapter 11, verse 28, it causes him to ask a couple of questions. And I think these are a couple of interesting questions that he asks. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? Now, we're not exactly sure what he's trying to say. There's a couple of ideas. But as I read this and as I look at the emotion behind it, I think Paul is trying to say, guys, don't you think I understand what it is like to question God? Don't you think I know what it's like to be angry at things that feel like they are injustice? In fact, I want to say this. Paul, this thorn in the flesh was so bad. Paul says this. He goes on to say, there were 3 times I pleaded with God. Now, when he says there were 3 times, he's not saying he prayed 3 prayers. This idea is that there were 3 seasons of his life that this thing got so bad that he pleaded and he pleaded and he pleaded at 3 different seasons. And God continued to say, no. God, please take it away. God, please take it away. God, please take it away. Please, God. This is driving me to the edge of my faith. God, there's something I cannot deal with. There's something beyond my control. I don't know how to handle this. And God said, give me 3 weeks and I'll think about it. No, he didn't do that. Next year, I'm going to just let this stay just a little longer, Paul. God said, no. I don't get it. Paul has been through so much already. The seasons of his life that are beyond what we could ever imagine, but he's gone through these seasons where he's physically been wore down. He's gone through seasons of his life where he's dealing with this emotional attack. And now he's got this thing that is tormenting him that God says, I don't want to take away from you, and I don't get it. There are times when you sit down with me and you say, Pastor, I've got a question. I'm going through this, and I want to know why God is allowing it. And I've got to be honest. Most of the time, I've got to shrug my shoulder and say, you see, we don't have an intellectual problem with God, do we? We have an emotional fight. We have an emotional doubt that sticks up, that raises its head, that God says, I'm still here. Doubt is not for the weak. Doubt is for those who come face to face with real trials and real struggles. But there is hope. Paul said in the middle of everything, he says, in fact, there is something that causes me at the edge of my faith, which puts me somewhere good. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, he goes on to say, But he says to me, and by the way, I do not fully understand this, but he says to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul was at a place that he couldn't go on his own. Paul was at a place that both physically, emotionally, and whatever this last, and I don't know whether this is a spiritual thing that is this attack, but whatever it is so bad that Paul says it was a messenger of Satan that is tormenting me. But something has to be given that is not of you, but is of him. We can have hope in this doubt, knowing that there is these moments when we cannot go on. But if we allow ourselves, he will carry us through. I want to say this. I believe Paul, even at this time as he's talking about it, was probably still praying and asking God to remove that thorn in the flesh. I believe he did not stop asking God to remove it. In fact, I believe it was probably something he continued to do. God, if it is your will, would you please remove this? God, if it is your will, would you please remove this? But at the time that Paul is writing this to the Corinthian church, God had said, no, I am not going to remove it. For I want my strength to be made perfect in your struggle. I want you to know me in your doubt. I want you to see something that only can be seen when you go through the hardest of times. It is only when we get to the edge of our faith that we find ourselves in the middle of his grace. I can't explain it, and I'm not here to tell you what it feels like or what it looks like. The only thing I know is that when you find yourself there, his grace can carry you through. I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, Paul does not say it is easy. Paul says it is still tormenting him. Paul did not have an intellectual problem with his faith. In fact, there was no intellectual problem. He had an experience that knocked him off of his horse, that caused him to see God and allowed him to see things. He goes on to say, I don't doubt who he is. But there is a struggle that I face that I cannot do on my own. Yes, you can. You can get through it. Because just like Paul, the edge of your faith can be the center of his grace. The edge of Paul's faith caused him to turn the world upside down. Paul's life did not get any easier. By the way, he found himself in Rome. He continued to find himself after this imprisoned. It did not get easier. You want to kind of read how his life ended up? Continue reading through the book of Acts, and it wasn't easy. But the edge of Paul's faith was the center of God's grace. The edge of your faith, when you say, I cannot go on any farther, is the moment to say, God, I need your grace, I need your strength, because I cannot do it. It is only when we realize that we cannot stand on our own that we find his strength to hold us up. Paul's edge of his faith turned the world upside down. when he learned to rely on God? What will the edge of your faith cause you to do? Where will it take you? Will you, like Paul, say, I can't do it, and so I am going to learn to rely? I'm going to allow myself to be at the center of his grace? The choice is yours. What will allow you to do? We're all going to find ourselves at a moment when we'll be at the edge. And Paul says, when I am at the edge of my faith, I find myself at the center of his grace. Dear Heavenly Father, as